Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this post-sermon conversation with Kerry Dick, our lead pastor, and my name is Christine Campen. I'm the pastor of Care at Bakerview. So hi, Kerry.
Hi, Christine.
Hi. We are coming to you from our living rooms, the wonder of technology,
Yep.
and we're meeting you in your living room.
Yep.
So in a time of COVID, when we need to stay home, this technology is pretty amazing, and we're glad to have it. So
Yeah, we're kind of getting used to it a little more. It used to
yeah.
feel new, and now it's starting to feel a little bit more normal.
That's right. Yes.
I
Uh,
think I've been on at least half a dozen Zoom calls this week,
yes.
like this, and more. Yeah, with more
And
people.
I got some Skype figured out yesterday because my husband is across the border, and so we
Right.
are Skyping every day, and it really helps to be able to actually see each other and not just be on a telephone call. So we're
For sure.
grateful for technology.
Yeah.
So on a computer screen together from our homes. So that was a great way to be able to stay connected as a staff as well.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Kerry preached the next installment of our Lent Psalms series, and he preached on Psalm 130, which you may have just listened to that sermon, which is posted on this page where you are listening to this conversation. And so we're just going to have some further reflections and conversation about that.
Yeah, kind of get a conversation going. We don't mean to think that we've got it all figured out here by any stretch, but
Oh,
maybe modeling some conversations and some questions that you could have around your own dinner tables.
mhm. Yeah, the Psalms bring up some pretty big questions about sin, about suffering, about who God is and who we are. And so, yeah, we don't have all the answers here today, but we're going to just talk about some different ideas and thoughts. And you might have some of your own that you will want to talk about with us after this conversation.
Mhm.
So, Carrie, one thing you talked about in your sermon was you said that Psalms give us words that we need. So could you talk a little bit more about the power of Psalms for healing? How would Psalms be a part of healing for us?
Well, I think why I'm thinking about that is sometimes if we're being honest, maybe not even sometimes, anytime when we're honestly wrestling with life, the questions, the situations of our lives, and maybe especially when we're finding answers hard to come by, and even trying to figure out our own thinking on it. You read a psalm, and all of a sudden it's like, yes, that's what I'm feeling, and it sort of gives you permission isn't quite the right word, but it helps you tap into your emotions in a certain way because of those words. You know, especially this Psalm 130. Out of the depths I cry to you. Like I talked a lot about what the depths are and an emotional challenge and even the time in which we find ourselves now. So just to hear those words, out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord, it gives voice to an emotion, and
Hmm.
there's a certain release that comes that's helpful. Maybe that agreeing with the psalm is a step towards our own healing because something's happening there. We're admitting something when we say, yes, that's what I feel like.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that healing isn't even just that what we're experiencing has just gone away, but part of the healing is knowing that somebody identifies with our experience or someone is a
Mhm.
compassionate listener. And even when the psalmist is praying these things or saying these things, I think there's an assumption that God is listening, that God is somehow present, and there's healing just in having that listener to hear
Yeah,
the words, hear the emotion and the suffering.
yeah. Those words just help us. They focus us a little bit. Sometimes when we're in a state of dis-ease or disorientation, finding the right words gathers our emotions, and we can then take them somewhere. Um,
Hmm.
Movement helps in in healing or getting towards a place of healing, as opposed to just being dissipated or I was going to say like a big blob just there. It's harder to figure out where to go if you're not being gathered in some way. And I think these words help gather us.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah. Yeah, as you were talking, it reminded me of when I used to work at a center for people that had experienced sexual abuse, actually, many
Mhm.
years ago in Saskatoon. I worked there for 2 years, and I remember being on a call with one woman who was questioning, did she really have to tell somebody in order to heal? And I said, yes, actually, you do have to. You
Mm.
need to have one person at least that you can tell what happened to you. And so that's speaking the words.
Yeah.
It's healing that comes just from that when there is a compassionate listener on the other side. So, and God is that compassionate listener for the psalmist.
Yeah, and I think when we get familiar with these words in the Psalms, like in the sermon, one thing that I did near the end where it says, "Israel, put your hope in the Lord." Um, if you recall, I said, Canada, put your hope in the Lord, for with the Lord is unfailing love. Um, Bakerview, put your hope in the Lord, and then I said you can insert your own name in there. Kerry, Christine, put your hope in the Lord. When we personalize these things and we hear our own voice saying them,
Mm,
there's something significant and strong about that.
yeah, yeah. I've actually memorized Psalm 130, but I've memorized it in the NRSV translation.
Yeah.
And I love how it says it in there that there is great power to redeem. And
Mm, yeah.
I love the way the NRSV translates that. With the Lord, there is steadfast love and great power to redeem.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, another file that you'll find on this webpage where you're listening to this is, I believe there's a file there of Calvin and Heather Dick who have played a version of Psalm 130.
Yeah.
And you referenced one song in your sermon by Steve Bell. It's a wonderful song from his Christian Year CD. I really enjoyed listening to that song in my car. And then there was the setting of Psalm 130 that you can all listen to. That Heather and Calvin have played. So that brings up a question of how does music or art or poetry, how do these things help us when we're suffering? What are some thoughts you have about that, Kerry?
Yeah. Well, I think art in general is dwells in the land of emotion.
Hmm.
Um, with art, we can say things that mere words cannot say.
Hmm.
And even words put down in poetic form, in some sort of artistic form, they get us to a place that mere words, I'll put it that way, don't seem to get. So, for example, the song that Calvin and Heather played, "I Will Wait for You" by the Gettys. Um, we sang it in our church. I referenced this in the little conversation I had with Calvin already, and when on that particular day, it did something in my heart.
Hmm.
I could have read the words, but putting it to music was something that evoked, that stirred in me. And the reason I talked about
Hmm.
the song "Mercy Now" in the sermon, as I thought about it earlier this week, it also stirred something in me. And I've listened to that song quite a few times, and I mean, it's a powerful song.
Hmm.
It's such a well-written song. I think somebody else wrote it, but he has um, got permission to use it on his CD, and I really love what he has done with it. It stirs something in me that mere words can't get to. Uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
even when you watch a good movie, or you see a play, and they're wrestling with challenging topics, they take you to a place that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise gotten to without engaging in that art. And
Right.
I mean, I'm not really answering your question directly, other than saying my experience with, and
Yeah.
I don't consider myself to be an art aficionado by any stretch, but I know what music for sure does uh, for me.
Hmm.
And
Yeah. And like when you say it takes us to a different place, or even to a deeper place,
mm,
um, the emotion, that emotion or the heart place is actually deeper than just the intellectual sort of rational part. And in churches, we've often, well, certainly in more probably the Protestant tradition, we focused a lot on words, sort of the word, the preached word, which is important, but we have often neglected sort of the more artistic part, art, poetry, music. We have, but those things allow God and God's Spirit to access us in some other place that just the word doesn't. So we need to have all of those things
for sure.
um, to allow us to connect with God.
So just before we went online, we talked about the picture that's on your wall right behind you. Yeah, it's
Yes. Yeah. I'm
another
just going to put up.
piece
Yeah, I'm just going to put up my screen a little bit here so
of it.
you can see the full picture. It hangs above my couch, protected. It's painted by Herta Clausen, who is a local artist. She's moved away into the interior now, but some of you maybe know her. And I received that painting at a difficult time in my life. And I would say that I have this art piece is actually an expression of what I feel like I've experienced since I
Mm,
received this picture, that I have been protected. And you can maybe see on there the light that's kind of shining out onto the path. You can't see where that light is coming from, but it's shining on the path that's somewhat hidden.
yeah,
And, the trees over top are protecting. And so I would say this is an artistic expression of
yeah,
something that I've experienced in my life.
sure. And I would say, um, for me, and you can speak for yourself, that when we look at paintings like that or we listen to music, that very often we're hearing God speak to us.
Mm.
Words of encouragement or comfort, um, support, maybe even direction. You know, we have to listen carefully in those settings for sure.
Mhm.
I think God speaks to us through our emotions, and so art can be very powerful in that.
Mhm. Well, and God is a God of emotions. When we are people with emotions, that's part of our being created in the image of God. God feels sad and angry and joy and all of those things. And God is actually an artist. When we look out,
He's the creator. Yeah,
yeah, just look out the window and we
yeah,
see God is an artist, and God is just wildly creative. So to when we express ourselves in all of those artistic ways, we are expressing our image of God, and it
mhm,
connects us to God and to each other in some ways that just word does not. So,
absolutely.
yeah, and it takes a prominent place in Scripture as well. That we would have the Psalms, poetry, which and the Psalms were set to music.
Yeah,
They were meant to be
right.
sung.
That's
So
right.
so that poetry and art is part of our scriptural text as well. So very appropriate. Yeah. Well, let's talk about sin and suffering. This is a big question.
Yes.
When we talked before we recorded this, we were going to say here, we're not experts on this.
Mhm.
We're not don't have the final word or all the answers, but we'll put some thoughts out there for people.
Yeah, I mean, this is
Question.
a topic. Sorry, this is a
Go
topic
ahead.
that really we need to talk about, and we need to keep on talking about it from time to time, depending on what's going on, realizing that we're never going to be finished with this topic.
Mhm.
Um, Not until the days of new creation, whenever that all unfolds for us.
Yes. When there is no sin and no suffering.
No sin and every tear wiped away. Yes, but here we are now. So yeah, I I quoted Eugene Peterson in this, and I also made a few thoughts about I wanted to make it really clear in the sermon that I'm not saying that uh, all of our suffering is the result of certain sins that we have done in our lives. That's too simple of a way to look at things, too simplistic. Um, it's more complicated than that. Sometimes we do bring suffering upon our own heads by poor choices or decisions that we make. That's for sure. Um, but the what I was trying to get at in the sermon, and even through the doorway to this topic, when it talks, I'm looking at my Bible by looking down there.
Yeah.
uh, verse 4 talks about the forgiveness, that in the Lord there's forgiveness. And so forgiveness of what? Well, verse 3 and 4 are talking about the heavy burden of sin that we do have. We have to if we're going to have our Bibles open, we're going to be talking about sin and what it is. So maybe I can ask you a question too, because I did say in the sermon that human sin has opened the door to suffering. So in a sense, in a grand sense, all of our suffering is caused by human sin. Because without that entry of sin into the world, would there have been suffering?
Right. Yeah, it's kind of a both and, isn't it? That all of the sin or suffering that we experience is because of um, yes, that entry of sin into the world, that we live in a world that is broken, that is not the way
Mhm.
that God had intended it to be. So there is that part, but and then there's also, well, somebody isn't necessarily suffering because they did a particular sin, and sometimes people have been uh, really made to feel guilty
Right.
or have been really judged by that. Well, you have cancer because you must have some kind of an unforgiven sin.
We don't want
Well,
to go there.
that's a pretty dangerous place to go.
Yeah.
So yeah, so there's sort of different levels or different ways in which we look at that. Then there's other kind of suffering that we do experience because of choices that we make, and there's a pretty clear correlation
Yeah.
sometimes between that. If someone chooses to be unfaithful to their spouse and that brings all kinds of brokenness into the relationship, well, suffering comes because they made a bad choice.
Yeah.
Um, and there can also be healing and redemption from that. That's the good news.
Yeah.
Um,
And sometimes people are in situations where they are suffering, and has they had nothing to do with it. It was imposed upon them.
yes.
So there
Yeah.
are times when our suffering, we have no cause in it.
Yeah. That's an important point, actually, Carrie. Thanks for bringing that one up. Is that choices that we make can cause suffering for other people. So
Yeah.
it matters what we do, not just for ourselves, but for other people that we love or people that we may never even meet. Our choices matter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if I can put it this way, the capital S sin, um, that issue that humanity has, that capital S sin is why we're having this conversation and trying to find the nuances of our suffering and the relationship between sin as individuals. It's because there is sin as a whole in the world. There's brokenness in the world that all of us have to reckon with.
Yes. Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
I just thought of this now. I mean, and we talked about suffering in the sermon as it relates to the whole COVID-19 crisis. Um, I want to just open the conversation because maybe some people have thought about this, or they've heard people talk about it. Is COVID-19 something that God is doing on the earth? Did God start this? Did he initiate it? That's a different kind of perspective to take than some who would say, oh, God is definitely active in this
Mhm.
and at work in the world through or because of or during this season in maybe ways that are new and fresh because of what's going on.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
I'm maybe answering my question at the same time by
Those are big
raising it.
questions. Yeah, they're big questions. And they're important ones because the way that we interpret that can also that then will dictate or influence the kind of responses that we have
Yeah.
to other people or to the crisis. Yeah.
You and I, and this is where we land in our church too, is that God is a God of love.
Hmm.
We often begin our prayers loving God.
Yes.
So in light of that, what is God doing with respect to the coronavirus? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And you ended your sermon with the verse from those verses from Romans that nothing will separate us from the love of God.
The love of God.
And
Yes.
yeah, the love of God. So nothing could be more appropriate right now than those verses that nothing separates us, not even an infectious virus that could even take our life potentially does not separate us love.
Yeah, and this is important for us to remind ourselves of it, and to have this hope settled firmly within us as we go about in the world in these days, because the world is full of anxiety um,
Hmm.
right now. And if we go to Romans 8, nothing can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ. Um, that has to mean something in the way we live.
Yes.
We of all people need to carry that love, that peace of Christ. We often use the greeting, may the peace of Christ be with you and also with you. Like, if his peace is with us during a time when there's a lot of anxiety, we really need to let that peace, and we need to submit to his peace in that. It's a powerful opportunity to reveal the reality of Jesus in our lives, to be
Yes.
people of peace during a time of crisis. Yeah,
Yeah. And it's a time where we can be challenged to grow in that, to grow in our
absolutely.
trust, to grow in trust, and for anxiety to become
Sure.
less.
And what I'm not saying is that, I've had zero anxiety during this whole
Yeah.
time. So that's not true,
No.
because I mean, I honestly, I haven't really been worried about getting the virus or anything like that. But everything, all the spin-off stuff that's happening, and decisions that we're faced with, and working from home for right reasons and all of that. I mean, that's caused some anxiety in me for sure.
Yeah.
That's why I
Somebody.
need to be reminded. I need you to tell me the peace of Christ is with you. Oh yes, and he's also with you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that actually reminds me of someone that I used to be in a church with who I heard him saying something once to someone else who was facing a difficult, sort of anxious time in their life. And I will always remember him saying to the other person, worry is an invitation to trust.
Mm,
So, yes, we do worry, and sometimes we become anxious, but then we're invited again and again to place our trust in God. So we don't have to, flog ourselves because, oh, I felt anxious today. Well, that's just human. But then we're invited to always come back again and again to trust in God.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Before we close, I want to just have a little bit of time with you to talk about that Eugene Peterson quote that you had in the sermon about Christians facing suffering. Could you maybe read that again? Let's have a
Yes.
conversation about that.
This is what it says. A Christian is a person who decides to face and live through suffering. A man or woman of faith who fails to acknowledge and deal with suffering becomes at last either a cynic or a melancholic or a suicide.
Mhm.
Sobering words.
Yes. Yeah, it's a pretty meaty quote there. Um, so Christians are people that actually face suffering. He seems
Mhm.
to have that as like one point of definition of what it means to actually be a Christian. That a Christian is someone who does not run away from suffering, but who faces it. Um,
I think that's exactly what he's saying, and I think he's also implying the problem of the reverse. Um, if a Christian is saying or thinking in some way that I shouldn't be suffering, that something's um, something, well, I've got to say that something's wrong with my suffering. But as soon as I say that, I'm going, yes, there is something wrong with suffering. Suffering is not meant to be. That's not what God intended for us. But there is suffering in the world. We can't deny that. And we still believe that God is in the world. So if we say that now we shouldn't be suffering at this moment, then in some way we're telling God that he's not doing enough for us.
Mm.
And we take matters into our own hands. And then that's when we become a cynic or a melancholic, or if we let it go too far, we start saying, why bother living then? If God's not going to help me now, why should I even live?
Yeah.
Compared to someone who has no faith, has no external person or place to appeal in their life. So just dealing with it by covering it or masking it or avoiding it, uh, maybe that's a reasonable response. But for the Christian, we're called to face it because Jesus
Mm.
suffered. He knows our suffering. He enters into our suffering. We enter into his. We can't get into a full theology of suffering, and I'm not even sure I'm equipped to do that. Um, but this is an important conversation for the believer, who legitimately suffers and who is in a lot of pain and difficulty. I'm not trying to minimize it in any way,
Mhm.
but where is God when there's suffering? Well, he's right with the sufferer.
Mhm. Yeah. It is a place where people do meet God in a very powerful
Yeah,
way. Not that we wish suffering on people, but it
absolutely not.
it can be a place where people do meet God in a very real and a varied way, and a place where people identify with Christ who has suffered,
Yeah,
and then there's identifying with the Christ who suffers and the Christ who suffers with the suffering in the world, and it
yeah,
becomes kind of this triad almost of Christ identifying with us, and we identify with him, and then together with Christ or with God, we identify with those who are suffering and suffer along with God and with those who are struggling. Yeah.
yeah.
That's,
And I mean, I'll put it this way: the shallowness of my experience with suffering. Really, I mean, sure, I've got some hardships in my life from that I have to deal with, but they seem minimal in some ways. And then I told in the sermon this person who was praying for refugees right now, and
yeah,
how that
yeah,
was contrasted so much about that we actually have the privilege to physically distance ourselves from one another. That was a stark uh,
yeah,
comment prayer that was mentioned in this prayer time. It makes me say that my the challenge of physical distancing is so minuscule when you think about 70 million people in refugee camps.
yes, yeah. That was a very interesting sort of uh, thing that person brought forward. That we actually have a privilege to social
Yeah.
distance. It's a very interesting, very
So
good, helpful way to think about
it
that.
puts our experience of suffering on a continuum for sure. Not to minimize it at all, but um, yeah, it's part of the conversation. We could talk more and more and never figure that one out exactly. So
I have friends whose son is incarcerated at this time, and the concern that they have because of overcrowding in prisons, and how if
uh,
a virus or something starts in even a Canadian prison, how quickly that can spread through a prison population because our prisons are overcrowded, or at
yeah,
least the federal ones are experiencing overcrowding. So even here in our own country, in a place like that, uh, people are crowded into cells that are made for one, and there's two or
yeah,
three or whatever, and they don't have the privilege of social distancing. So
right.
always helpful to keep things in perspective.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yes.
Well,
This is a psalm of hope.
yes. With the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is great power to redeem.
Yes, great power to redeem.
So we look for how God is at work and will be at work through this crisis, because God is always working for goodness, always working for wholeness, even when we can't see how that might be happening.
But
That is
we're people of faith. And if I could close with the image of the watchman waiting for the morning. I think this is it captures the feeling, the thrust of the psalm so well, because the watchman knows the morning is coming.
Mhm.
It is sure. It's not gonna not happen. So our confidence is that sure that God is with us. And that's the nature of our hope. It's a sure hope. We're waiting, but it's coming. So let's carry that posture in these days and in all days.
Yes, that God is coming as sure as the morning will come.
Yeah.
Yes. Great. Well, thanks for the conversation, Kerry.
Thank you, Christine, for hosting and engaging in this unique way to connect with each other. So
For
it's good.
sure. And thank you. Yeah. Sorry, did you have one more thing to say there?
No, I'm just trying to figure out how to end the conversation. When we're
Okay. Well, I'm just going to say thanks to everyone who joined us for this conversation. As always, you can join us by sending us an email or calling us if you want to talk to us further. Maybe you found encouragement in this. Maybe you disagreed with something we said. You can give us a call or email us for another conversation. So thanks for joining us. Stay safe and healthy, and join us again next week. Have a good week. Bye-bye.
See you soon.